Because too often we either have been programmed or we allow ourselves to fall into the pattern of negative, I'll make it a double negative, decreation. In other words, we focus so much on the, our condition to focus so much on the negatives that we don't realize that we are also creating, drawing, and manifesting those negativities in our lives. And one of the, for me, one of the transformative things about Genesis, in particular the first chapter, is that it is a model for procreative activity, because it is demonstrating through the ritual of the 6 days and of the seventh day how creation is ongoing and how it is very positive. Notice that if you read that chapter, there's nothing negative that's ever mentioned. It's always mentioned as being good, and then in the culmination of the 6th day as being very good. And then on the 7th day, which is actually the most important day, the Shabbat, the day of rest, as being the whole creation itself is now holy and therefore whole. It's complete.
It's complete.
Through these processes and these series of generativity. And what we, in my opinion, need to remember and relearn is how to change the switch from the negative to the positive. And you can do that better sheet at any moment.
At any moment.
It's up to you.
And start a whole new course of action.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every time and at any time. Sometimes you have to sit back and catch your breath and take a deep breath and put things in perspective. But there's never a moment that you cannot take the opportunity, as I teach my students, to just breathe and be filled with the Ruach. It's called the Spirit, the breath of inspiration. Again, in chapter 1, it talks about the Spirit, the breath, the consciousness of the Elohim, of the creative power that comes over the chaos. And as it comes over the chaos and does an assessment of the chaos, which means we can do an assessment of problems but don't dwell on them. Then the Elohim speak, Vayehi or, Yehi or, let there be light, enlightenment, illumination. And there was illumination, which tells us that intention and thought and manifestation are interconnected. So what we are thinking with enough emotional power and feeling will manifest. Hence, pay attention to positive thoughts and don't feed the negative ones.
Seems to me that this message is very timely because there appears to be a lot of rampant fear in our culture right now with all the changes, rapid changes that have been taking place and all the fear surrounding the healthcare system. So your message seems to be very timely, that at any moment, if we're caught in the fear, we could stop and, you said, take a breath. Can you talk more about that? What does that look like?
Well, first of all, recognize that like attracts like. And so the more individuals are focusing on the problem, the bigger the problem is going to become. The more amplified it becomes. And it will almost take on a life force of its own. Well, what's the counterpart to that? The counterpart to that is to, as I indicated, recognize the challenge as an opportunity. That inside of the problem is also the solution. It was inside, for example, of the chaos and the so-called confusion in the opening verses of Genesis 1 that the divine consciousness also perceived a solution. First, to bring light on the situation, and then with that enlightenment, to see how that can be transformed. How to take that would-be problem as actually a seed of potentiality. So that means collectively, it's important for us not to obsess over the problem, but to work on the solutions. And solutions are unlimited. They truly are. We defeat ourselves with the ongoing negative affirmations, because that's what they become, or negations. But we, as you indicated earlier, we are in the image of that creative power. And so the same energy, the same imagination that goes into the negative fixation can be utilized to transform it into a positive solution. And it doesn't mean that it's static. That's the other thing, is that solutions are ongoing. And new problems present new opportunities. It's how you look at it and how you interact with your environment. Both your external environment and probably more importantly, your internal environment. Because this is where the action is really taking place in terms of our perception.
How does the breath relate to everything that you're
The
talking
ruach.
about?
The ruach.
Can you
is
speak
called,
more about that?
Yes. Well, I tell my students that the breath is really, if you think of it, breathing is one of the first things we do when we come into this incarnation, and one of the last things we do as we prepare to leave or reincarnate. So breath really, for me, is that connection between this world and this other dimension. And so taking the opportunity to breathe, it really rejuvenates the body. And not just the body, but also the mind, because body is also mind in a more condensed form. This is all mental consciousness in different forms. So breathing, intentional breathing, is a way of being centered and coming back to a very important principle. Everything is a matter of giving and receiving. It's all about enhancing then how we give and how we receive. And so, again, in the Genesis story, you have the divine being constantly generating and giving. And this is why it is good. Because in giving, we also project what we want to receive. Whatever you want to receive, give that. And that is what will come back to you, amplified. It's very simple. Nothing complicated about it. It's very simple.
I have often heard that in Genesis there are two separate creation stories, but I understand that you say there are three.
There could be three. Let me explain why. In chapter 1 of Genesis, we have a version of the story that gives creation from day 1 to day 7, and it's emphasizing what the Elohim or what God is doing in a series of 7 days. Then, in verse 4 of chapter 2, there's actually a switch. And we know this in the Hebrew, and it says, Lord God. And that means now this is another creation story that has been placed side by side with the first one. And this one emphasizes much more human agency. And so a human agency that has been created by God, but also has very specific responsibilities and the consequences of those responsibilities. Then a place that most people hardly ever mention is chapter 5 of Genesis. But chapter 5 is another genealogy. It's another story of creation where the Creator creates a being who's called also Adam. And the word Adam simply means earth being. And then it relays the way in which this earth being now also brings forth children, and they bring forth children who are both male and female. So this, in a sense, is also another description of creation. So we really have 3 points of view. And most of us are familiar with only the first and second chapters, but they actually are 3. And the first 11 chapters of Genesis, in fact, stories that are being told from different points of view of how we got here and what we are to do with the gifts that we have and the consequences of not using those gifts in the best possible way.
So unlocking the mysteries of Genesis will empower us to look at our life in a new way, take greater ownership on our own participation in creating our life.
Because these are archetypal narratives about creation and about the human condition and about problems, but as I said before, also about solutions. So if we approach and appropriate Genesis as also a collection or an anthology of stories, we won't get stuck in just thinking it's only linear. It's only a linear description. It is contemporaneous to who we are now. You're told not to eat from a particular tree. That's also a description of the human condition to be inclined to do what you are asked not to do. If you say, I gave an example once before, anything in my home is yours. You can just do whatever you want to as my guest, except for this one thing here on the table. Now, there's one thing on the table in my computer. Just don't touch the computer. Well, what does that really tell us about human nature? Now my attention is drawn to the computer. And why is it special? And so these narratives are telling us things about our